Greetings. Back on the 18th of July, our friend, the good doctor over at the We Woke Now account, put out a video titled Spirit of Issachar, Take That Back to Church, Part 2 of 2, in which he had a small portion on the subject of the pews. That in itself is interesting because this was supposed to be a reply to Issachar, and in previous replies to Issachar, he had declared that, the discussion on the pews is off the table. He's taken it off the table. Well, I guess, maybe for his audience or something like that, he felt the need to put something out there. And so what he did is he resurrected an older argument that he's made before in the past. However, he didn't actually address any of the precise arguments that Issachar put out on the pews. But nonetheless, it's worth taking a look at this old argument that our friend, our right honorable friend, the good doctor, put out, which was to argue that when Boubacar Diakité, the scholar from Harvard, whom PBS brought to First African Baptist Church, when Boubacar Diakité described the markings on the pews as, quote, an Arabic type of writing, end quote, he merely meant something along the lines of them looking like Arabic, being so much looking like Arabic to the point of being mistaken for Arabic. But in actuality, it's solitreo. So here, listen to what our friend, the good doctor, said in this video, again from July 18th.
The people who built these pews paid homage to Christ, but also left a surprising trace of another African religious past, Islam.
This is Arabic type of writing.
I want to introduce you to a Semitic writing that can easily be mistaken for Arabic. Unfortunately, many have ran with the notion that the pew in question is Arabic. Again, the key word is type, which means having common characteristics. There is a language that resembles Arabic. As you see, it's not Arabic. That language is called Judeo-Spanish. This is a language that was spoken by the Sephardic Jews. This language can be written in print, which is called the Rasi. It can also be written in a cursive script called Solitreo.
Now, as I said, that was an argument that he's made before. And it's interesting because the argument was later at risk of being contradicted by something else that appeared on his channel, which was in a video from May 15th. So again, this claim about what Arabic type of writing allegedly means and how it just means it resembles Arabic, but it could be something else. This argument predated May 15th, but on May 15th, he had shared an interview that Will Brown of the Boom Church had done with some producers for the PBS documentary, and they had stated that Boubacar Diakité actually felt that La ilaha illallah and Muhammad Rasulullah appeared on the pews. And so, it seems to me that this is at odds with this resurrected argument, that if he is saying that this quote-unquote Arabic type of writing reads La ilaha illallah, then it's not merely something that resembles Arabic, it's actually Arabic. But here, listen to what appeared in this video from May 15th, which was titled Road to Savannah, Make Some Noise, Episode 1.
So I did just find the email. So the scriptures, the ones that we sent him of the pews, the side pews, it's like one that looks like a squiggly line is Muhammad is his messenger, and the other one that he translated was no God but Allah.
So again, if Boubacar Diakité felt that the markings on the pews contained the phrase La ilaha illallah and then somewhere else Muhammad Rasulullah, then I don't think he was merely saying that they're just markings that resemble Arabic. It seems that he believed that some of the markings were literally Arabic. And again, I want to make this clear, as I've made clear in previous videos, I'm not saying you have to simply defer to Boubacar Diakité, although that was the policy that some on Dr. Kelly's side had when they thought they had Bunis on their side. They were saying the non-experts should simply defer to the experts. But taking a consistent position, as I always have, I would say that you are free to question that claim. You're free to be skeptical about that claim. But nonetheless, it puts what Diakité meant in a different light. Having established that, there's more to be said here because regarding this show from May 15th, Benayah came on immediately after that clip and presented an argument for why the markings could not contain what Boubacar Diakite apparently believed appeared on one or two of the pews. So he's going to present an argument for why the suggestion of Boubacar Diakite is actually absurd. So listen to what Benayah said. And again, this is from the same video from May 15th, Road to Savannah, Make Some Noise, episode 1. Here you go.
Wait, the church was promoting Mohammedism. That's not what First African Baptist Church Pastor E.K. Love D.D. said. In fact, the church spoke about the importance of First African Baptist Church members preaching against Mohammedism and what it called pagan, heathen religions. As the following reference reads, and it reads, finally, using our schools as a powerful instrument, our denominational family is to wage an uncompromising war with superstition, beat back the forces of paganism, and make religious conquests in China, in Japan, in Asia, in Africa, even in Rome, the very heart of Catholicism. When we remember that the 1,400 millions of souls belonging to the human family, only 1/4 of them profess the Christian religion. And when it's remembered, Mohammedism, with its sword and its Quran as the ensign of its power, holds powerful sway in the southwestern part of Asia and a large part of Africa. Yea, when our missionaries in foreign fields must admit the fact that the followers of Buddhism and Brahmanism comprise more than 1/4 of the inhabitants of the globe, and that the Roman Catholics, with their order of Jesuits, overrunning every portion of Africa to which they gain access, then you will not fail to be impressed with the magnitude of the obligation which lies at the doors of Christianity, and how Herculean must be the efforts on the part of the Baptists of this country to subdue and to supersede the various forms of pagan religion as they flourish in the heathen lands.
Okay, so the reasoning that Benayah was employing there was basically that because Emanuel King Love's book on the First African Baptist Church has within it a sermon in which someone makes a statement hostile towards Islam, then it's impossible that anyone else had written anything Quranic or Islamic, or anything like that on any of the pews. The premise, the central premise of his reasoning would roughly go as follows. If someone in the church expressed hostility towards Islam, then no one with any ties to anything Islamic visited the church, or at the very least, no one with any ties to anything Islamic visited the church and made markings on the pews, right? That seems to be the central premise of the argument. But I'd like to explore this because I don't think that premise is obvious. While he assumes the premise, it doesn't seem at all obvious to me. In fact, I think that the premise is false insofar that you can have one person in the church who's hostile to Islam and then have another person in the church who might have some Islamic vestiges. And, I'll get into this a bit later in the video. He doesn't necessarily have to be a Muslim, as Boubacar Diakite himself said, but you could have a person in the church who has a Muslim past and still retained vestiges of his Muslim past. I would say that later on that night on Sister E's channel, there was another show titled Savannah After Show. And Dr. Kelly said something in passing about Benayah's argument, which I think has the potential to provide us with an interesting analogy, which I'd like to bring out in this video. So let's hear what Dr. Kelly said there. Here, listen to this.
And I just think about what Benayah, even just what he shared, what the nugget that he dropped at the end of the presentation, to kind of use the voices of the I would say the fathers in Israel voice. I'm not even going to say pastor. I'll say what they were referred to, father in Israel, when they spoke against Islam. They spoke against a number of other pagan or heathen religions. So that was just a mic drop right there to address a lot of the stuff that's been being pushed out there about us.
So What I have in mind is, in particular, is that phrase "Father of Israel." Benayah, Dr. Kelly, Will Brown, and others around them were quite excited by the fact that the members of First African Baptist Church had employed that phrase, Father in Israel. And so I think that might provide a helpful analogy for that discussion. But before I get into that analogy, I'd like to show one more clip. And this one is from June 9th. It's another video that appeared on the We Woke Now account. It was on a video titled Late Night Playbook, Caught Between Two Opinions. So here, listen to what Dr. Kelly says here very quickly.
No matter how many would try to come up with different arguments and different narratives, number one, the voices of our ancestors in their own writings makes it clear they speak against Islam, they speak against Roman Catholicism, they speak against Freemasonry, all inside this book.
So note that Dr. Kelly pointed out that aside from people showing hostility towards Islam, they were also showing hostility toward, there were people who also showed hostility towards Freemasonry. And that's worthy of note, because what they mean is, just as you can find someone, you can find a statement in Emanuel King Love's book on First African Baptist Church, just as you can find someone making a statement hostile towards Islam in that book, so too you can find persons making arguments hostile towards Freemasonry. And so I think that's going to provide an interesting analogy in which we can explore Benayah's reasoning in his argument against the possibility of someone writing something Quranic or, Islamic, on one of the pews. So here's what I'm going to propose as an analogy. I'm not actually making this argument seriously. Rather, I'm just going to present it for the sake of argument. So let's suppose there's an argument that the phrase Father in Israel, using this phrase to refer to an elder within your community, within your congregation, may have been influenced by Freemasonry. That is to say, while I'm not actually arguing that, because the reality is that the phrases like that, of that structure, referring to using Israel self-referentially, was fairly common before the rise of dispensationalism. And I think people lose sight of that, or they, this sort of, this modern, 21st century, which is very much influenced by dispensationalist thought in America, people sort of struggle to imagine that prior to the rise of dispensationalism, a lot of people, Protestants and Catholics and even Freemasons, were using the word Israel self-referentially without such being a reference to their lineage. Whatever the case, we're just going to, again, for the sake of argument, for the sake of a thought experiment, for the sake of analogy, we're going to imagine an argument which proposes that those in First African Baptist Church who use the phrase Father of Israel for elders within their community did so under the influence of Freemasonry. They inherited this term from Freemasonry. That's the argument. It's not an argument I'm actually making. It's just one that I'm using for the sake of argument. It's a hypothetical, right? So with that in mind, let's see if we have evidence of Freemasons using that phrase. First up, we have this book titled Proceedings of the Grand Commandery of the Knights Templar for the state of Wisconsin. And it's a book that was published in 1867. And on page 40, you can find members of this Masonic lodge referring to a member of their community who had passed away, and you'll notice that they refer to him as, quote, a father in Israel, end quote. So that's one example of Freemasons using this phrase, father in Israel. A second work I'd like to point to is this work from 1870 titled The Masonic Mirror. And on page 110 of that book, you find reference to Masons in Sacramento and referring to a member of their community who had passed away, and he too is referred to as, quote, a father in Israel. So that would be a second reference in which, this is a second example of Freemasons using this phrase, father in Israel. If you'll forgive me for beating a dead horse, I'd like to look at a third example. And this third example is this work here, which was published in 1868. And it's titled Proceedings of the 51st Annual Communications of the M.W. Grand Lodge of the state of Indiana. And on page 15 of that work, you can find another example, in this case referring to a living member of this community of Freemasons. But once again, this person is also being referred to as a father in Israel. So I think it makes it very clear that Freemasons were using this phrase, father in Israel. Now, having said that, let's now rebut that hypothetical argument using Benayah Israel's line of reasoning. So we can now turn to the very same book which Benayah Israel turned to, which is Emanuel King Love's book on the First African Baptist Church, titled simply First African Baptist Church. This is a sermon which is found on page 303 of that book. It was a sermon titled The Work and Purity of the Church by Reverend Henry Jackson. Okay? Now, this sermon was a scathing indictment of Masonry. For example, on page 304, he states the following, quote, "The ministers of the Lord Jesus Christ should not be members of the lodge." And he goes on to state that the lodges are sapping the very life of the church, end quote. Then, on page 305, the same sermon is quoted as stating, "Masonry is contrary to the spirit and genius of Christianity." And then, on page 306, it stated, "It is not befitting for members of the church to declare in the church that salvation is in none other than Jesus, and then go into the lodge in the presence of Jews and pagans and dare not open their mouths of Jesus or breathe his holy name," etc. Right? So, I hope that's clear that now, in the very book that Benayah had appealed to, just as there's a portion which quotes someone making statements hostile towards Islam, so too, as Kelly Richardson had noticed, you can also find statements made by someone which are hostile towards Freemasonry. So now, let's apply Benayah's argument. Let's apply the same reasoning. I would put it this way. Just as someone in the church expressing hostility towards Islam precludes anyone else there from having Islamic interests, then so too, someone in the church expressing hostility towards Masonry precludes anyone else there from having Masonic interests, right? This is the same reasoning that Benayah employed. Now, the only reason why I went down this road, why I came up with a hypothetical argument about Masonic influence on the church and then knocked it down using Benayah's reasoning, is because we can now use this to explore Benayah's reasoning. I hope it's clear that the logical structure of this argument against Masonry is the same as the logical structure of Benayah's argument against Islam, or the possibility of anyone in the church having any sort of, Islamic vestiges or Islamic interests. To explore this sort of reasoning, I'd now like to turn to page 175 of the very same book. There was a deacon in the church who was passing away. He was going towards the end of his life, and he spoke to Emanuel King Love, the man who would go on to author the very book that we're quoting. And he states that at one point, as you see underlined in red, that the Masons and the longshoremen will bear my funeral expenses. This immediately should raise a question. Why was this deacon so confident that Masons would handle some of his expenses? Now, there's two possibilities here that some might wish to argue. They might say, well, maybe, even though it says Masons with a capital M, he didn't mean Freemasons. Maybe he meant literally, like stonemasons or something like that. Or another possibility is someone could say, oh, okay, maybe just that one deacon. Maybe he had Masonic influences, but whatever, that's just one deacon. I think that alone, if that was the case, that would start to undermine the sort of reasoning we saw. But let's continue on. We have one example where it seems that a deacon in the church felt comfortable enough telling Emanuel King Love himself that Freemasons would take care of his funeral expenses. Jumping over to page 245, there's another sermon by the Reverend Alexander Ellis, and he gave this on the centennial celebration, which was held in 1888. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because Alexander Ellis was also a Freemason. For example, consider this book, which was published in 1885, titled Proceedings of the 100th Anniversary of the Granting of Warrant 459 to African Lodge. On page 6 of that work, it was noted that the very same Alexander Ellis of Savannah, Georgia, gave the benediction at this celebration, this centennial celebration of this granting of a certain title to a specific African lodge, or a Masonic lodge. And then, on page 9, it's noted that that Alexander Ellis, the Reverend Alexander Ellis, used to be a grand chaplain. He used to be a chaplain within this Masonic system. So Alexander Ellis, who has a sermon recorded in Emanuel King Love's book, was himself a Freemasonry. So aside from that deacon, you have the Reverend Alexander Ellis. So we have now two apparent Freemasons, with some sort of connection to the church, visiting the church. But let's turn to another example. I'd now like to turn to page 165, where there's some discussion on Deacon Sims, James Merrillis Sims. It's, as I have highlighted here from page 165, he was in charge of the woodwork of the church. He was actually someone who was involved in the building of the current edifice. So I don't know if he literally put his hands on the pews, but being that he was in charge of the woodwork, it's likely that he had a major saying in that. He had some influence on the woodwork of the church, and that likely includes the pews. If you turn to Charles Elmore's book, Savannah, Georgia, Black America Series, it was a book for the Black America Series. In that book, it's noted that the very same James Merrillis Sims had started the Eureka Lodge, which was the first Black Masonic lodge in Georgia. So this person who was in charge of the woodwork at First African Baptist Church and one of the people involved in building the current edifice himself had ties to Freemasonry. So that's three people now. And by the way, James Merrillis Sims' founding of the Eureka Lodge in Georgia is also mentioned on page 314 of the book Saving Savannah. So, as I said, that's three apparent Freemasons with some ties to the church. Regarding James Merrillis Sims, the book also makes clear that he had a rocky relationship with the church. He was ousted from the church, then he came back, ousted again, and eventually he wound up with another church of a very similar name. But nonetheless, it seems clear the Freemasons were involved with that church in certain degrees. So yes, you did have a person who was hostile to Masonry giving a sermon, which is recorded in Emanuel King Love's book, but you also have Freemasons in the church. It's interesting, however, let's return back to that sermon by Henry Jackson, The Work and Purity of the Church. Again, this was a sermon which was very clearly hostile towards Freemasonry. You might notice that there's an asterisk right next to the title of the sermon on page 303 of the book. That asterisk, you can follow it to a footnote at the bottom of the page. And that footnote reads as follows, quote, "The majority of the hearers being members of some societies, this address was not enthusiastically received, and Reverend Jackson could not finish his speech as prepared. This is greatly revised." In other words, it is true that you can find a person making statements hostile towards Freemasonry in the church, or at least recorded in Emanuel King Love's book about the church. You can find someone who's making statements hostile towards Freemasonry, but that does not mean that everyone else shares his views. As is made plainly clear here, other people in the church were hostile to his sermon precisely because they themselves were members of these secret societies. In other words, there were indeed Freemasons in the church, despite the fact that there were people in the church or visiting the church who were hostile to Freemasonry. Now, I want to say as a disclaimer, I am not trying to tarnish the church by bringing up Freemasonry. I'm merely using this as an example. I don't intend this in any sort of conspiratorial way. I know certain people hear Freemasonry and a red flag goes up, an alarm bell goes up, and it's understood to be a polemic. That's not the way I intend this. I'm merely stating the historical facts. It is a fact that someone at the church gave a sermon which was hostile to Freemasonry. It's also a fact that there were other people who were Masons at the church. Masons were visiting the church. There were Masons who served at least temporarily as deacons at the church. There were Masons who gave speeches at the church. There were Masons who were even able to interrupt an anti-Masonic speech at the church. With that in mind, let's return to this reasoning that we had looked at earlier, where it was noted, employing Benayah's reasoning, we noted the following, that just as someone in the church expressing hostility towards Islam precludes anyone else there from having Islamic interest, so too, someone in the church expressing hostility towards Masonry precludes anyone else there from having Masonic interest. But clearly we know that that second part is false, But if the second part is false, then likewise we should argue that the first part is clearly of a sort of faulty reasoning. So let's revise this to read differently. I would instead put it this way: just as someone in the church expressing hostility towards Masonry does not preclude others there from having Masonic interest, so too someone in the church expressing hostility towards Islam does not preclude others there from having Islamic interests. Now, again, I'm not arguing that there were necessarily Orthodox Muslims in the church, although it is possible that some Orthodox Muslims may have visited. But whatever the case, it's entirely possible that you had Christians there who had vestiges of Islam. They may have come from Muslim families. They may have had Muslim childhoods, and there may have been vestiges of Islam that stayed with them. Interestingly enough, being that there were Freemasons there, Freemasons, and I don't mean this in any sort of conspiratorial way, but it is simply a fact that Freemasons in many respects have a great respect for Islam in theory. Not necessarily Islam in practice, not necessarily for Muslims, but for Islam in theory. There is a long history of Freemasons having a positive sense about aspects of Islam in theory, not necessarily in practice. With that said, I want to put out this point. We should not pretend that we know who made those markings, any markings on those pews. We can assume that different people made different markings on different pews, but whatever the case, we should not pretend like we know who they were and what their backgrounds were. There's this weird game that's played where people will act as though they know the linguistic backgrounds of whoever made those markings, the religious backgrounds, but of course they don't know. They don't even know if all the markings were necessarily made by congregants or if some markings were made by people who were visiting. As I've noted in previous videos, some have proposed that some markings may have been made by people who were moving along the Underground Railroad. So it's not necessarily the case that every marking on the pews was made by someone who's a congregant in good standing in the church. So with that in mind, let's also note that we also shouldn't pretend that if someone put some Arabic on a pew, that there's someone else there to check it. For example, does Benayah wish to propose that if someone did write La ilaha illallah, there's no God but Allah, on a pew at that church, that specifically the person who is recorded making statements hostile towards Islam, specifically that man, was there to check it? That, for example, A, he would understand Arabic, and B, object, right? Like, how do we even know that there were people there who could check this? Like, if someone wrote Arabic on the pews, why should we assume that necessarily everyone else in the church would even recognize that? That's also food for thought, But whatever the case, I'll close here. The point is that, with all due respect to Benayah, who I do respect, one person being hostile towards Islam does not preclude others who visit the church from having Muslim vestiges, from having a mind that memorizes and repeats and writes down statements that are typically associated with Islam, whether it's a Quranic phrase like Ilahi Nas, or a statement like, from the first part of the Shahada, La ilaha illallah. Right? There's nothing precluding that, and simply saying that there was a person who was recorded in the church as being hostile to Islam does not preclude that. And that's the main point of this video. Just as one person's hostility towards Masonry does not preclude Masonic interest or Masonic vestiges in other members of the church or other people visiting the church, so too, one person expressing hostility towards Islam does not preclude other members of the church or other people visiting the church from having, Islamic interests or vestiges of Islam within themselves. And that's it. So, with all due respect to Benayah, his argument did not refute the claim of Bubakar Diakite. Now, I'm fine with people saying Bubakar Diakite's claim has not been proven yet. They would like to see the precise pew, which allegedly has La ilaha illallah on it, or Muhammad Rasulullah, right? I'm fine with people saying that. I'm fully in favor of people saying that we should not simply defer to a scholar, rather we should just treat his statement as a possibility, but, we reserve the right to question it and to ask to see which pew allegedly has this and to examine it for ourselves. That's fine. But Benayah's argument did not refute the possibility, did not refute the claim which the producers of the documentary attributed to Bubakar Diakite. And on that note, I'll close here. As I always say, as always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.